Welcome again. It's so good to see a full house. For this question and answer period, you can address your questions to either Father McCarthy or John Carmody. And there will be, please identify yourself when you address your question, and we'll have 2 mics to come to you so that everybody can hear. Father McCarthy, you're on.
I must be well groomed for the TV, you know. Gee whiz.
I have a question.
Good. Okay, good.
I have 2 questions from the quad. And my name was Kay Barrett, and I also live in the quad, and they're watching with great interest. And the first question is, how did the Christian church get so far away from Christ's teaching of agape? Agape, if you say it.
And the second question.
Oh, what should we have done in World War II? Just let Hitler continue to kill the Jews and take over the world.
Ah, yes. Well, how did the church get so far away from Jesus' teaching of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, and into this terrible, terrible situation of being the single largest sociological unit on the face of the earth that has killed people in the last 1,700 years? It's those people that identify themselves as Christian. It wasn't always that way. Wasn't always that way. Original Christianity absolutely rejected violence, absolutely insisted upon love your enemies. So much so that, as you know, the Gospels were not someone following Jesus around taking notes. They were written decades after. And the fact that they preserved out of all Jesus' sayings that one sentence for sure, there may be more, but that one sentence, love your enemies. And the fact that they preserved how he died, not just that he died, but how he died, doing God's will and what God's will was that he was doing. In other words, literature, world literature is filled with people dying, cursing people, calling down wrath on people, hating people. The Old Testament is full of it. But Jesus doesn't touch that. There's not an ounce of that. And so that was original Christianity. So how long did it continue that way? Well, the general historical thought is that Christianity preserved itself in terms of Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies for 3 centuries. Now, this does not mean that there was no Christians using violence for 3 centuries. It means that the church did not say it was right to use violence, that it was consistent with Jesus' way to use violence. People committed adultery in the first 3 centuries, but that didn't mean the church justified it. The church did not justify either. What took place was the understanding was pretty much summed up by St. Basil, who was the founder of monasticism in 3-something in the East, 100 years, more than 100 years before Benedict in the West. When Basil was asked, what's the difference between a good monk and a bad monk? He said, a good monk falls and gets up, falls and gets up, falls and gets up, falls and gets up, falls and gets up. A bad monk falls and calls it good. And therein lies the difference, huh? That's the critical difference between being willing to repent of what is utterly inconsistent with loving as Christ loved, utterly inconsistent with the Gospels, and going about the business of doing what is utterly inconsistent with the Gospels and doing it in the name of Jesus. For approximately 3 centuries, there's debate about exactly, like we have 1776, July 4th as a date, but there's always things going around before and after that. Those are just kind of time signs, landmarks. But for approximately 3 centuries, the church was straightforward. If you follow Jesus, you followed the way of Jesus, which was a way of nonviolent love and friends and enemies presented in the gospel. Or as one of the fathers of the church phrased it, when Christ disarmed Peter, he disarmed all Christians. It was that simple. It wasn't a complicated matter. This was just the way that you live the life of a disciple. So, what took place? Well, these were 3 centuries of terrible persecution. Now, the persecution wasn't as terrible as it is in Christian legend. But there were three times that the Roman Empire decided upon, as policy, the liquidation of the Christian community. The last of those was at the beginning of the 4th century, 300, towards that time, it was with Diocletian. And these were murderous persecution, absolutely. This is the equivalent of the Nazi final solution. That's what it was. But beyond that, for these 3 centuries, persecution or no persecution, Christianity was an outlawed religion in the empire. To be a Christian was to be a criminal per se. Therefore, depending upon who was the procurator, who was this, who was that, in areas, Christians would be persecuted with more or less zeal. But certainly for 3 times, it was an empire-wide effort. The last of those efforts were by Diocletian at the beginning of 300s and right around there, the end of 298, 6, something like that. And here's what happened. One of the 4 procurators of the Roman Empire, Rome was run by 4 procurators, decided that he wanted to quit the job. It was just too much trouble, he didn't want it. So he quit. And he gave the job to his son. His son's name was Constantine. Constantine, not being satisfied with being one of the 4 top rulers of the Roman Empire, wanted to be the sole ruler. So he went to war against the other Western procurator, Marcinius, and they went to war and they fought and they battled and, well, one way or another and back and forth. But the thing was, Constantine's father didn't like this, so he decided he wanted to be proconsul again. This was too much. So Constantine says, "Not in your life," and he murdered him. He also murdered his brothers and sisters because he thought they were threatening his position, not just for fun. So, as we get the story historically, and remember, victors write history. Victors write history. We get this story from Bishop Eusebius. who was the first normally recognized historian in the West, but who was also Constantine's house historian. He was the kept person in the Constantine royal court, kept bishop. And he writes in his Life of Constantine that on the night of between October 28th and October 29th, 312 AD, Constantine had a vision. And in the sky there was something called a labarum that looked something like a cross, which he interpreted to be Christian. Then, underneath it, it said, in this sign you shall conquer. And so, on the night between October 28th and October 29th, 313, Julian calendar, he painted on all the shields, all the horses, all the helmets, all the armor of his men, the cross. It was the first time that a Christian symbol was used to lead people into the mass slaughter of war. October 29th of 312. At the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine won it. He won it. And he went from there to become the sole emperor of the western half of the empire in 313. And when he became sole emperor of the empire, now this guy lived to be not only sole emperor of the empire, he lived to be the emperor of the entire empire till 337. That's a long time to hold power in that world. Most Roman emperors lived approximately 10 years and were murdered. He lived till 337. This guy was one political fox. He knew what he was doing. At any rate, in 313, he issued the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan said that Christianity was now a legal religion in the empire. Christianity was now a legal religion in the empire, and therefore anyone could be Christian and not be persecuted. Now, why did he do that? He did it because he recognized the truth that Tertullian, and one of the fathers of the church, wrote, "The blood of martyrs is the seed of Christianity. The witness unto death is impressive." If I tell you something, that's one thing. If I'm willing to die for what I tell you, boy, that underlines it a little bit. And so, remember what the common consciousness was of the Roman Empire in 313 and before. Stoicism. Stoicism was like capitalism is in our consciousness. It just was in the air. It just was what people accepted. But we know what the word stoic means. It means restraint. And it was the idea that you were a human being on the basis of using your free will to restrain yourself from whatever those things were that caused you pain, and to do, up to a point, those things that brought you pleasure. But it was a philosophy of the will. Of the will. And that meant that as people got old, or as they deteriorated, or as they got injured and harmed and couldn't function as they would normally, and therefore the will couldn't override the psychological, the physiological breakdown, the ultimate act of Stoicism was suicide. That was Stoicism. That was the religion of the empire, more or less, in terms of the consciousness that the government and the atmosphere. Okay. So what took place was Constantine saw that 300 years of Roman persecution, 300 years of Christianity responding as Jesus responded, as St. Stephen responded, to death, pain, imposed by others, did not produce the elimination of Christianity. By the time Constantine became the sole ruler of the Western Empire in 313, Christianity was the largest religion in the empire. Without an ounce of violence, it had grown by the witness. And why was the witness important? Because Stoicism, that consciousness, ends in annihilation forever and ever and ever. All there is this life and the will. Human integrity, everything that there is, value system, is all in the will as you live it in this life. You had the martyrs, the children, the families, the people being brought in, actually never to the Colosseum, it was the Circus Maximus, being brought in and dying, willingly dying for this way and this person who is behind the way. And dying as the person did. Not hating and full of revenge and retaliation and so forth and so on. Now, those deaths weren't easy. It doesn't, being eaten by lions and burnt on crosses, that's not easy stuff. But the 65,000 people in the stands every day or whatever it was that they had these, month or weeks, what they were seeing was someone's who weren't afraid of death. Someone who believed that there was more to life than just being another piece of clay on earth for a while. They were seeing it, and not only were they seeing it proclaimed in word, because the Christians were out there talking, but in deed. People were actually willing to die rather than break with this person in his way. And not one or two. And that was impressive. And that got people thinking. And that got people thinking that there's hope beyond life. And that got people thinking, if this is the way to eternal life, that's what I want. Because there is a longing within each one that we simply not be destroyed. So, it grew. Constantine saw it. He said, this is not the way to approach this. We're losing the battle. What we got to do is, we got to bring in the Christians to the empire. Make them part of us. Let them experience the goodies of the empire. And so he did. He not only issued the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity a religion that was legal. He immediately began to confiscate pagan Roman temples and give them to Christians. Now, Christianity prior to Constantine was primarily a non-temple religion. Churches, house churches, upper rooms, you name it, was where liturgies took place, people prayed, people gathered. But after Constantine, now there were some places that were churches that Christians had, but it was primarily not that. The Eucharist, gathering together, pray and so forth, could be done in catacombs, it could be done in jungles, you name it. There was no need for the buildings, let alone the huge buildings. He gave them. He gave them to Christianity. And they came with a lot of land, not just the building itself. And all of a sudden, Christianity is no longer quite the religion of someone that didn't have a place to lay his head. In 315, 2 years later, he did something that that was decisive. In 315, he gave, because the church was so organized, I mean, it was organized in eparchies and dioceses, and he gave the bishops the right to judge civil and criminal cases within their diocese, and to back up that judgment by the power of the Roman army and military, the police power of the state. And the bishops took it. And they became agents of the state. Agents of the state, judging and justice and backing it up. My rule will be backed up by the power of the Roman Empire, meaning the gun or the sword or whatever. Then from that very, very beginning, things gradually evolved, and in 368, St. Ambrose, who's a miracle of grace in the church, St. Ambrose writes the first speck of a just war theory. Never before in the history of Christianity is there one word justifying war until we get to Ambrose. That's 368, almost 400 years after Jesus, before the first sentence is written. Now, Ambrose is a miracle of grace in the church. Why? Because Ambrose, remember at the time of Ambrose, the catechumenate before, the catechumenate was not 9 months or 2 days or whatever it was, you know? The catechumenate was a long, long time. And the judgment was, by the community, whether the person was able, willing, desiring to live the way of Christ. Did they believe in him enough to live that way? Then they'd baptize him, totally immerse him in Christ. So it took years to become a Christian as an adult. Ambrose went through the catechumenate, was baptized, received confirmation, was welcomed into the Eucharist, was ordained a deacon, was ordained a priest, was ordained a bishop in 8 days. 8 days. Ambrose was the head of what would be the equivalent of the Rockefeller family in the United States, except it was in Milan. Milan was where the money was, like New York, Wall Street. Rome was just where the puppets were. But the real power was in Milan. And Ambrose was head of the Rockefeller family of Milan, except more so. And Ambrose was elected Bishop of Milan and all that stuff there because of the acclamation of the people. They wanted him. Ambrose couldn't baptize himself, ordain himself. The people wanted him. And so they got him. And Ambrose, in his own writing, says he doesn't know anything about Christianity. He's got to learn. But in the process of putting it out there, one of the things he did do was he did write the first seminal sentences about it being all right for Christians to engage in war to protect the empire, if that were necessary. That's the man who did it. And his famous student is Augustine. St. Augustine's just war theory is what every church uses to this day in some form or another. And by the way, St. Augustine never said that there could ever be such a thing as a just war, that there was a just war. All he said was that if there is to be a just war, that is a war where the killing is justified, unjustified killing being murder and always wrong, that war had to meet certain standards. had to meet certain standards. And I've asked hundreds and hundreds of people over 45 years, what are the standards of the just war theory? I've never met one that knew them. Even priests. Augustine wasn't fooling around. We're talking about taking human life, and he set up standards that, quite frankly, are impossible to meet. But today, now I'll speak for the Catholic Church, but today, I bet there's not 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of the Catholics in the world that know what the standards of the Catholic Church are for a just war in terms of Catholic morality. And yet, I'd say 99% of the Catholics will say, oh yeah, well, we don't believe in that nonviolent stuff, we've got a just war. They know nothing of what they're talking about, and the reason they know nothing is because they're not taught. Because if the standards of the just war were taught, no war could ever meet them, and no government ever prepares their wars according to them. Anyway, Augustine writes his just war theory, And so what we have in 311 AD, you could not be a member of the fighting Roman army and be a Christian. By 416 AD, the Emperor Theodosius II, you could not be a member of the fighting Roman army unless you were a Christian. The whole thing turned itself upside down on its head. And then from there, it's downhill quick. Once you begin to exercise the power of violence, it corrupts. It corrupts. So that in a Synod of Arles in 700, there's a canon that reads, priests cannot use clubs in war, they can only use spears because of their sacerdotal position. Only because they're priests. They're holier than others, so they can't use clubs, they can only use spears. Clubs are messy, I suppose. And then we come to what is probably the nada of Christian history, the Crusades, where Christians are killing Muslims for a piece of dirt. For a piece of dirt. For what does Christians need a piece of dirt for? Jews may need Jerusalem, Muslims may need Mecca, intrinsic to their religion, but Christ is risen. Anywhere where two are gathered in my name is fine, it's a holy place. What's the piece of dirt for? And indeed, there was no concern for the piece of dirt over in that part of the world for 3 centuries until Constantine's mother went there, Helena, and made it something important to him. But anyway, we come up to the 11th, 12th century, and we have the Crusades. And the Muslims had come into existence at 654, something like that, and then they're going to conquer and blah, blah. And we have the Crusades. Now get this. The first plenary indulgences in the Catholic Church. Now plenary indulgences mean you go right to heaven. Right to heaven. You got a plenary indulgence, you go right to heaven. The first plenary indulgences in the Catholic Church were given for homicidal violence. The first plenary indulgences in the Catholic Church were given for killing Muslims in the Crusades. It's kind of like Khomeini did back there. You know, he gave those little crescent stars and gave them to children, actually. If you go out and you kill an Iraqi, you go right to heaven in that war. Be that as it may, the Crusades just, it's all done in the name. Here's Jesus who said, turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, love your enemies, and so forth. And here's his church giving guarantees to heaven for killing people. Once it was seen how well plenary indulgences worked in the Crusades, it was only a matter of time before the power mind, the violent mind, the mind that lusts for prestige and prerogative, either through the church or through the state, began to see the possibilities here. And so, when heretics were burnt at the stake, whether they were Jews or other forms of, those were called auto-da-fés. They were massive social gatherings. They weren't just like, we kill people today at 12 o'clock at night in Huntsville, Georgia, and no one sees it or anything else except a few people. No, these were extravaganzas like the Super Bowl. And Jews and heretic Christians and so forth were brought up, and they were burnt at the stake. And this was advertised for weeks and weeks before all around. And everyone who came was granted a plenary indulgence if you came to an auto-da-fé. But that was only a start, because once it was seen how well it worked there, well, by golly, we could use these things to motivate people to literally liquidate heretics. And so, literally, Catholics fought against other Christians under the motivation of plenary indulgence. The Albigensian community was wiped out completely under plenary indulgences. And every Catholic that killed an Albigensian was a Christian and was killed in the process, went right to heaven. Now, this is how it happened. This is how it happened. Until we come right up to this hour and day and so forth and so on. I mean, we talk about the Reformation, but what Reformation is there? There's the radical Reformation of the Mennonites, Hutterites, so forth and so on, Quakers. But what Reformation? Luther, Calvin, the Pope, huh? The only thing they agreed on is they could kill each other and be following Jesus. Julius II, who was the Pope at the beginning is the last Pope ever to lead an army into battle. This guy liked to fight. And he had this massive stallion in silver armor that he'd come at you just like you could imagine. And he come to take your head off to destroy you. I don't know who would see the Vicar of Christ coming at them like that and say, here comes Jesus. And Luther called Julius II a butcher, which he was. But Luther knew where his bread was buttered too. Because he wrote, remember, Luther was defended against the Catholic Church by the princes of northern Germany. They were his protection. And he wrote, because at that time there was a peasant revolution of massive scales going on, he said, it is easier for a prince today to go to heaven killing a peasant than by prayer. But it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. And it's a disgrace, and it's evil, and it's untrue, and it just isn't the gospel. But it's the predominant consciousness of Christians worldwide today. By far, 98%, 95%. It makes no difference what level of church you're talking about. Popes, bishops, cardinals, lay people, ministers, I mean, it's just the predominant consciousness. But that's the history of how we got to where we are. What else did you?
World War II.
What's that? World War II. Oh, yeah, well, I guess the first thing to note about World War II is, if you're a conservative Catholic, and even if you're a conservative Christian, even if you're not a conservative Christian, if you're a liberal Christian or a liberal patriot of the United States or a conservative patriot of the United States, there's this very conservative Catholic guy, worked for Reagan, worked for Nixon, wrote for the New York Times, still very on television all the time, giving the conservative view of things, Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan published a book last year called The Unnecessary War, footnoted in the extreme. The Unnecessary War. World War II. The title, The Unnecessary War, comes from a memo that was recorded by Franklin Roosevelt when Churchill was here in the early 1940s. Churchill said to Roosevelt, "If the people knew how unnecessary this war is, they would hang us from the nearest tree." And Buchanan goes through what it is, all of the things that could have been done. First of all, not to go to war. And secondly, what in fact was going on at other levels that no American ever perceived. No American ever perceived. For example, Hitler was being financed by the bank that John Foster Dulles and his brother Alan Dulles were chairman of the board and the executive director of in New York. For example, if you were to look at Hitler's desk where he sat and did his work and so forth, the picture right up above the desk for his whole time was Thomas Watson, president of IBM, creator of IBM. General Motors supplied Hitler with everything he needed until Roosevelt finally stopped them in 1942. The unnecessary war. But the question really gets down to that you can say not just what about Hitler, but what about you name the person. Just go to one country, any country at all, France or Romania and so forth, and they will all say, what about this one? What about that one who was attacking the country, the nation state? And the answer is, where in the New Testament do you find that Jesus ever said that a follower of his can do in a crowd what they can't do alone? Where? Well, more time. The problem is this. Jesus is not concerned about the survival of Rome. Rome is essentially trivial to Jesus. He doesn't address it. He doesn't care about it. Rome executes him with the help of the Jewish leaders. But he is not he says, my kingdom is not of this world. And therefore, how do you walk away from Jesus' teachings of nonviolent love of friends and enemies, which are right there on the page, which you are called to as a disciple, and go out and use violence to kill people, maim people in war, just because some human lump of clay like yourself says they're the enemy and now you've got to go kill them? It makes no difference whether it's Roosevelt or Churchill or Napoleon or Caesar or anyone else. Where is the authority for doing that? Well, the authority is my survival, my nation's survival. Well, as we said last night, no nation survives. Every nation goes like the blade of grass, dust falls away. As far as the person is concerned, if you're really interested in survival, then you would not choose temporal survival over eternal survival. Jesus lists a way to eternal survival. He says it. Love your enemies, do good to you, pray for those, blah, 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 all that, we know. The cross. The cross is the road to eternal survival. The gun, whether in the cross turned upside down, is the sword. And regardless of the motivation for using it, whether it's to defend the Croatia or Romania or whatever it is from this one or that one, that may be acceptable in conscience for people who were not called by Jesus. But there is no logical way to move from the teachings of Jesus and say, I am following them in the terms of murdering people and killing people to defend a piece of dirt. even to defend your own life, which Jesus didn't, and which Stephen didn't, and which the first 300 years of Christianity, and probably a lot more than that, but 300 years of Christianity didn't. Remember, the Roman Empire knew what the United States government knows, England knows, every government knows, and that is you want to control the adults, threaten the family. And the Roman Empire just didn't kill people, they killed families. And yet, that's what the Christians did. They would not part company with the eternal way for what was going to perish anyway. But that came from Jesus. So that's a start. Anyway, yes, you were going to say.
Who's next?
Mike.
Who's next?
He right here. He had his hand up there.
David.
He was ready to go.
Thank you. All right. There was a woman caught in adultery, and she was being chased down and ready to be stoned, and Jesus interceded. What would he do for the 1 million people that were in the concentration camp about to be executed?
He would positively, absolutely, for a start, say, except the 3,500 of them that were in the ship St. Louis off the coast of Florida, that Roosevelt, the United States government, said, those Jews can't come here, let them go. Secondly, the issue is never that one dies. Everyone dies. How we die can be painful, it can be easy, it can be in this situation or that situation. The issue is not how a person dies, the issue is death and what happens. And therefore, Stalin killed 30 million people of his own people. Mao Zedong did the same thing. But before Hitler, before Mao Zedong, before Stalin, Christians in America did the same thing to American Indians. Massive genocide in terms of tens of millions of human beings, starting back with Cotton Mather in Massachusetts, who has some of the worst sermons you could ever imagine. They're equal to anything a pope said in calling a crusade.
But you can't justify wrongs with other wrongs.
You what?
You can't justify wrongs with other wrongs.
Not trying to do that. All I'm trying to say is the issue is death, not the way people die. And therefore, it is appointed for all men once to die. And after death, judgment. Therefore, the question becomes not how I die, but how I live. And therefore, to the extent that it's possible to follow the way of Jesus and interfere with someone being hurt or killed, stop it or interfere with it, or modify it, a Christian is absolutely bound to do that. Bound to do that. But no Christian has it within her Christianity or his Christianity the right to preserve physical life by a way that Jesus says is evil. That is not within the Christian's perspective. It might be within Hindus, Buddhists, Judists, and therefore all kinds of things are available to people. But because we are, as a people, Christians, since we are nurtured for hundreds and 1,000 plus years into our default position on everything being violence, we can't even think of an alternative. So let me give you an example. One of the great Christians of the 20th century, great Christians, was Clarence Jordan. Clarence Jordan was a Baptist minister. He had a bachelor's degree in agriculture and a doctorate degree in Greek. And then in the 1940s, he founded Koinonia Farms down in down in Americus, Georgia. And he saw this as what God called him to do, because he said, where in America do I see the greatest of evils? And it was racism in the South. Southwest Georgia at this time, in the early 1940s, was Nazi America for black people. That's what it was. Now, so what does he do? He says, Jesus doesn't write papers on the subject. He goes and brings love to where there's evil. So he set up Koinonia Farms, which is an integrated black, white community, farming community, Christian, all Christian, and they began to live there. And of course, you all can imagine what happened. The burnings, the beatings, everything that went there. Now, they lived Christian lives. They lived in separate houses, and they lived and so forth. There was nothing like a hippie movement or anything like that. This was real Christian life. And Clarence was a brilliant man. But anyway, there's this story, there's this piece that he's told. It's told. After he was there almost 10 years, and people were more and more disgusted with the whole thing. And remember, Americus is right next to Plains. Immediately, it attaches to Plains, Georgia, where Jimmy Carter was. Well, and Clarence had done all kinds of things. I mean, he had tried in all kinds of ways. For example, one Sunday, he brought to his Baptist church a black man to pray on Sunday. And that very night, he got called by, I don't know who it is, the elders or whatever it is that run the church, and they called him down, and they're going to throw him out of the church. And he asked them, he took out his Bible, and he put it in front of the first guy, and he said, right there, you show me what I did wrong. He went down the whole group of how many there were. And the last man said, Clarence, we don't care what's in the Bible. We don't want any niggers in our church. We don't care what's in the Bible. So, this is an event from Clarence's life that will shed something here. Remember, to begin with, all people must die. The issue for the Christian is not dying, it's living. It's living. Christ comes to tell us the way to live, as he did up until his death. Okay. In the early 1950s, in Koinonia Farms, life was hard. Crops were burned, all that stuff there, people beaten. But one night, something happened. One Tuesday night, something happened that had never happened before. And that is, about midnight or so, 3 cars pulled into the place where the housing was for the people, the families, and machine gunned randomly the whole place. Just machine gunned it. Now remember where you're living and the terror those people are living under, and now you add this. No one was killed, but they just missed being killed. You know? And so the next day, you know and I know, and we can all imagine the conversations that took place, and they're recorded. We've done this experiment in love long enough. These people cannot be touched. You know, love doesn't touch them. You know, we got to get out of here. Our families are here, you know. Look, the machine gun bullets, they came close. They could have killed someone. And so they discussed it and so forth, and Clarence said, no, his point was, Jesus didn't run from evil. He confronted it with love. That's what we got to do. We got to pray, we got to love. Now, he went down to the local papers and everything else and tried to explain to them. He went down to the pastors of all the churches in the area, and they all told him the same thing. You are responsible if anyone gets killed, because you're bringing the niggers in there. You. The next Thursday night, the same thing happened, except this time it was even worse, the amount of machine gunning. And by this time, people just want to get out, and some did, and some did. But all the time, he's saying the same thing. We cannot respond to violence with violence. We have to respond with love, and we have to use our minds to figure out how to do this. And remember, there's no end to what grace can do if we rely on it, if we trust it. What are you going to do? You know, no one's helping them. No one. Well, anyway, what takes place is the third Thursday afternoon, 3 white guys come up. And they want to see Clarence, and he walks out. And they tell him what no one could know unless they were there about what happened in the 2 previous weeks of the machine gunning. So he knows who they are. And they say to him, Jordan, if you don't get the niggers off the land tonight, the sun is not going to rise on this place in the morning. I don't know, the atmosphere had to be drenched with terror. These were just mean guys who meant business and who had been nurtured in that deeply. And it was a world where black people just disappeared. Lynchings were a common practice. Southwest Georgia, early 1950s. And so, Clarence, he heard them say it. Jordan, if you don't get the niggers out of here, by tomorrow morning the sun won't rise in this place. Everyone knew what was being said. And Jordan said, boys, remember, he's a Southerner all his life. He knows that world. He says, boys, he said, they told me in seminary that there would be boys like you. There were possibly boys like you on the face of the earth, but I didn't believe them. He said, they told me in seminary there could be Christian boys like you. And I said, that's impossible. He said, they just told me in seminary that this was possible, and he said, to this second, I never believed him. He said, but let me, he said, shake your hand, he said, because I'm glad to meet 3 boys that can make the sun stand still. They laughed. He saw a wedding ring on one of their fingers. And he said, do you marry? Yeah. Do you have children? Yeah. How old? You know, that's a little kid. He said, look, he said, you know what it is when you're up all night with a child, little baby, and the baby's crying and crying and crying? You know, and then you're up all night with the baby, and then you got to go to work the next morning. You know what kind of day it is for you? Right, well, yeah, you're crazy, you're tired, you're exhausted. Now, he said, you know what it means? He said, you come home at night, and then for the next, whatever it is, nights, the baby's up, and you're up every night, and you're going to work every day, and you try to, he said, the guy said, you're just gone. People shouldn't be around you. You got to do your work, but it's really, you're crazy if you stay up all those nights, you know. He said, well, look, he said, we got a mother and father in there. They have a little baby, new baby. The baby's been off and on, up all night for the last 5 months. They hardly get any sleep. It's been going on week after week, month after month. The baby seems healthy, but just wakes up and starts crying, and they're up, and he said, they're exhausted. Now he says, boys, he says, what do you want to come in here with those machine guns making all that noise, waking that baby up? You know what it is that those parents have to get up. The hate never stopped, but there was never a machine gunning again, and no one was ever murdered. I say that because which one of us faced with that situation as Jordan was, which one of us would have picked out the phrase, "the sun won't come up here in the morning," to work with? Which one of us would have seen the wedding ring on the finger and used it? What I'm saying here is, people don't act in crisis situations any differently than they act day in and day out. As we have been nurtured, so we will respond in the crisis situation. If we are faithful in little things, then we'll be given bigger things. But you cannot be spending one's life having as your default position, well, I don't care what the Bible, Jesus says, the gospel says, I'll use violence, and then expect to be nonviolent in the crisis situation. That won't happen. Clarence Jordan, from the day he was in seminary, in fact, before he got into seminary, he writes about it, he knew Jesus was nonviolent, and that was his way, that love was the answer to evil, and this is what he was committed to. And everyone that came to that community was committed to that. And they prayed over that, and they prayed together over that. And they didn't just work for that in terms of the outside. That was fundamentally, it was in terms of the group itself. And then when the crisis came along, he had that answer. But suppose what he chose didn't affect the people the way he thought it was going to affect them, and they came back that night, and there was a mass murder. What better way to die than following the way of Jesus? What worse way to die than to abandon the way of Jesus to survive and then have your head blown off? And so it is, And so it is. You and I can only do what we can do. Violence didn't stop the Holocaust. Violence didn't stop Hitler. Violence didn't stop Stalin or Mao Zedong. Violence didn't stop the genocide of the American Indians. And we go on. Nor did violence stop anything that Caesar was doing in Jesus' time. Nor did Jesus stop it. He went up against it with love where he could do that. And then he called people to do the same where they could do it in time and space. So the Jewish people that say to us Christians, I don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, Christ. Why? If Jesus is the Redeemer, why doesn't the world look more redeemed? Messiah is not a Hindu term or a Chinese term. It's a Jewish term. It's a Hebrew term. They know what Messiah is, and they know what the Messiah is to bring. Where's the redemption? Where's the world as it's supposed to be changed? And of course, we Christians give the glib answer from Chesterton. Oh, it's not that Christianity has been tried and failed. It's that it hasn't been tried because it's so hard. Ha ha. We're not talking ha ha. We're talking about salvation or not salvation. And so indeed, I don't know what the response would have been to the Holocaust, but no response was given anyway, or any other form of violence. But what I do know is we will act in the crisis moment according to our chosen way of acting over a period of time. But if we fail to act in the crisis moment as Jesus would have acted, then that's sin. That's sin. But the St. Basil said, you've fallen, get up. The gospel, the good news is Jesus forgives and forgives instantly if we but ask. But the minute you say, I've fallen, and what I've done, the sin I've done, is good, then we bypass the one thing necessary for forgiveness: asking. Because you do not ask for forgiveness for what is good. Yes,